Imagine, if you will, a world shrouded in mist, where dense forests stretch beyond the horizon and rolling hills hide the whispers of ancient tribes. This is Gaul, long before it became a province of Rome, a land of fierce warriors, sacred groves, and fortified hilltops that seemed almost impossible to conquer. Sit back, relax, and let your mind drift across the plains of Burgundy, where the hilltop settlement of Alesia looms above the surrounding lands. From this vantage point, GIC forces an alliance of Celtic tribes watched, waited, and prepared, their eyes fixed on the advancing shadow of an empire that had dominated the Mediterranean for centuries. They were not mere villagers or farmers. These were warriors raised in the art of combat, familiar with every hidden path, every forested glade, and every strategy that the land itself seemed to favor. And yet, even as the morning fog curled through the valleys, a Roman force was moving with relentless precision. Julius Caesar, a man whose ambition matched the empire he served, had turned his gaze to Alesia, understanding that the hilltop was more than just stone and earth. It was the heart of resistance, the key to controlling central Gaul, and perhaps the fate of countless lives. Some scholars believe that Caesar saw not just the tactical advantage, but the psychological one. A victory here could shatter tribal alliances and send a message across the forests and rivers of Gaul. Others suggest he was guided simply by necessity, knowing that the GIC's growing power threatened to ignite rebellions that could spiral into chaos. The winds that swept across Montexuis whispered of the coming siege, carrying the scents of pine, wet earth, and anticipation. From the outer walls of Alesia to its inner sanctum, every corner of the stronghold hummed with activity, as soldiers sharpened weapons, arranged supplies, and waited for the moment when their world would collide with one of history's most disciplined and formidable armies. And so begins the story of the Gallic Wars, not with the clash of swords, but with a quiet tension that stretched across miles of land. A tension that promised both destruction and transformation. As the sun crests the horizon and the first Roman scouts appear, one question hangs in the air, unspoken yet palpable. Who will endure, and who will be swept away into the annals of history? The first movements of Caesar's legions were almost imperceptible at dawn, a ripple across the landscape that betrayed nothing of the immense force gathering in the shadows. Over 10 legions, veterans of countless campaigns, advanced with a precision and discipline that seemed unnatural against the fluid, chaotic energy of the Celtic resistance. Each soldier carried not just weapons, but the weight of Rome's expectations, the unspoken understanding that failure was not an option. Alesia, perched like a crown on Montexuis, offered its defenders natural advantages, steep inclines that funneled attackers into narrow paths, dense forests that concealed ambushes, and high walls that demanded ingenuity to breach. Caesar, however, had learned from previous encounters that a direct assault could lead to disaster. The failure at Gergoia still lingered in the minds of his commanders, a memory of overconfidence crushed by the clever defenses of the tribes. So, instead, he turned to the art of containment, the slow, methodical siege that would wear down both the body and the spirit. Timber, stone, and earth was summoned from the surrounding countryside, and Roman engineers began constructing double circumvallation lines, walls stretching for tens of miles, enclosing Alesia while shielding Roman forces from the massive relief army that Caesar knew was assembling beyond the hills. Obstacles, pits lined with sharpened stakes, and carefully placed artillery emplacements transformed the rolling terrain into a network of deadly precision. From the perspective of the defenders, the hills themselves seemed to rebel, reshaped into a trap that mirrored the ingenuity of their enemies. The GIC forces, under Vercingetorix, responded with their own tactical brilliance, coordinating sorties and counterattacks designed to disrupt construction and fracture Roman organization. Small groups of warriors would vanish into the trees, only to reappear along the line of fortifications, striking where the Romans least expected. Messengers raced across the landscape, carrying signals of impending attacks, the air thick with the tension of anticipation. Caesar observed it all, not from the safety of a distant command post, but alongside his soldiers, eyes scanning for weakness, mind calculating the precise moment to exploit it. Some historians suggest that it was in these hours, before the first major clash, that the psychological battle was won or lost, each side testing the other, probing for flaws, feeling out the enemy like a predator circling its prey. And as night fell, cloaking the hills in shadow, the campfires of the Romans flickered against the darkness, mirroring the uncertainty that hung over Gaul itself. The first phase of the siege was a quiet, tense dance of preparation and anticipation, but beneath the stillness, the rumble of war was growing louder. The question remained, when the calm shattered, who would survive the coming storm? As the sun climbed higher over the plains of Burgundy, the siege of Alesia entered a phase that would test every ounce of Roman endurance and ingenuity. The outer circumvallation, a vast ring of earthworks stretching for 13 miles, had begun to take shape, each section a testament to meticulous planning and laborious effort. Soldiers moved in choreographed precision, hauling stone and timber, digging ditches, and constructing fortifications, while under constant threat of GIC harassment. Vercingetorix forces did not wait idly. They launched sudden, unpredictable sorties, sending small units to sabotage siege works or lure Roman detachments into ambushes hidden among the dense undergrowth. The clash of iron on wood, the cries of men, and the sudden thrum of arrows striking shields filled the air with a tense, almost cinematic rhythm, a reminder that the calm of early morning had been deceptive. Caesar's tactics relied not on brute force, but on manipulation of both terrain and psychology, channeling attacks into pre-designed killing zones and using carefully placed artillery to disrupt formations. Some researchers believe that the psychological strain of seeing the circumvallation steadily rise, despite desperate attempts to halt it, weighed heavily on the defenders, eroding morale even before the first full-scale assault. Roman engineers constructed communication lines along the inner wall, allowing rapid coordination between sectors, enabling swift reinforcement wherever the GIC attempted to breach. Meanwhile, scouts and messengers moved silently through the shadows, feeding intelligence to Caesar, who calculated every move, anticipating the enemy's strategies. Night did not bring relief. Fires burned along the siege lines, casting long, flickering shadows across the rugged hills, and the sounds of distant drums and shouting occasionally pierced the dark, signaling attacks, counterattacks, or feints. The GIC relief army, reportedly numbering over 250,000, loomed beyond the horizon, a gathering storm of disciplined tribal contingents ready to strike in concert with the garrison. Some historians argue that the scale of this force was unprecedented, a collective effort that demonstrated not only Vercingetorix's influence, but also the deep networks of loyalty and coordination among Celtic tribes. Roman legions, though outnumbered, relied on discipline, fortifications, and calculated timing to neutralize this advantage. Each day blurred into the next as siege works progressed, defensive lines expanded, and skirmishes escalated, creating a relentless cycle of exertion and vigilance. And yet, beneath the exertion, an eerie patience governed the Romans, a quiet confidence that slowly, inexorably, the balance of power was tipping. The tension hung thick over Montexuis, a palpable anticipation of a conflict that would not be resolved through a single clash but through the grinding, unyielding mechanics of siege and strategy. The question lingered, when the relief army finally arrived, would the Roman preparations be enough to withstand the greatest threat they had yet faced in Gaul? The arrival of the massive GIC relief force transformed the siege of Alesia from a protracted engineering endeavor into a high-stakes test of Roman tactical ingenuity. As the distant horizon seemed to ripple with the movement of tens of thousands of warriors, converging from across Gaul, their banners, painted with tribal symbols, fluttered in the wind, while the rhythmic beat of drums echoed across the plains, carrying a sense of unity and impending menace that could be felt even within the inner Roman lines. Scouts reported the enemy's formations, and Caesar, standing upon a raised platform, surveyed the landscape with a calm, calculating eye, weighing the risk of open confrontation against the deadly efficiency of his fortifications. The GIC forces, united under Vercingetorix command, attempted to coordinate complex maneuvers, dividing units to simultaneously harass the siege works, pressure the inner circumvallation, and cut off Roman supply lines. But the sheer scale of their force introduced inevitable delays, miscommunications, and gaps that the Romans could exploit. Roman archers and artillery units rained bolts and stones into the advancing lines, targeting choke points deliberately engineered into the GIC attack routes, while concealed pits and sharpened stakes inflicted casualties that disrupted the cohesion of the enemy ranks. Some observers suggest that the psychological impact of these hidden defenses, combined with the disciplined coordination of Roman counterattacks, gradually eroded the confidence of tribal warriors accustomed to overwhelming opponents through sheer numbers. Caesar's legions moved with a terrifying synchronicity, sending reinforcements to threatened sectors with precision that seemed almost preternatural, a reflection of rigorous training and strict adherence to command. The battle unfolded like a tense chess match, with the Romans leveraging fortification, timing, and terrain, while the GIC forces relied on the audacity of coordinated offensives and the momentum of vast numbers. As night fell, torches illuminated the tense standoff, casting shifting shadows across the ramparts and siege lines, and signaling that the confrontation was far from over. GIC leaders attempted nocturnal raids, hoping to exploit the fatigue of the Romans, but every attempt was met with calculated resistance, as the inner lines, reinforced and prepared, repelled attacks with methodical efficiency. Throughout this ordeal, Caesar's presence, calm, authoritative, and unyielding, served as both a tactical and psychological anchor for his troops, inspiring them to withstand pressure that would have shattered lesser forces. The encroaching darkness did not signal safety, but a deepening suspense, a pause pregnant with possibility, as the stage was set for the climactic engagements that would determine not just the outcome of the siege, but the future of Roman authority across Gaul. And yet, beyond the flickering walls of the circumvallation, the question loomed: could even the mightiest Roman preparations withstand the full fury of a united Gallic uprising? As dawn broke over the plains of Gaul, a muted fog clung to the slopes of Montexuis, shrouding the Roman siege works in a ghostly veil that seemed to soften the edges of the massive conflict about to resume. And yet within that haze, the tension was palpable. Caesar's legions, arranged with meticulous precision along the inner and outer circumvallation, waited with an eerie calm, each soldier understanding the deadly choreography that the day would demand. The GIC garrison, emboldened by the proximity of their relief army, renewed assaults with ferocious intensity, their warriors surging against walls and barricades in coordinated waves, while archers loosed volleys designed to harry engineers and disrupt fortifications still under construction. Roman artillery responded in kind, hurling projectiles over the walls with a precision that betrayed years of experience and countless campaigns, while concealed defensive measures inflicted unseen casualties, turning the terrain itself into a silent ally of the besieging force. Vercingetorix's command proved astonishing in its sophistication, orchestrating simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Yet the scale of coordination required to manage over 250,000 warriors stretched even his abilities, and the gaps in timing and communication allowed Roman units to exploit weaknesses without revealing the full strength of their numerical inferiority. Caesar moved along the lines, inspecting ramparts, speaking with centurions, and issuing orders that balanced strategic necessity with tactical flexibility, ensuring that reinforcements could shift fluidly to threatened sectors while leaving other positions uncompromised. The clash of shields, the thunder of hooves, the cries of men, and the whistling of arrows combined into a symphony of chaos that echoed across the valleys, a sound that would haunt the memories of both victors and vanquished. As the day progressed, minor skirmishes escalated into larger confrontations, testing the limits of Roman endurance and ingenuity, while Vercingetorix's forces adapted, probing for weaknesses, adjusting formations, attempting to overwhelm isolated sections of the Roman fortifications with concentrated bursts of energy. Historians suggest that the psychological strain on both sides was immense, with Roman discipline battling against Gallic resolve. And yet every failed assault, every repelled wave, gradually eroded the morale of the GIC warriors, highlighting the brutal calculus of siege warfare, where strategy, preparation, and leadership could outweigh sheer numbers. By evening, the battle lines remained tense. Both sides bloodied but unbroken, the ground littered with the detritus of combat, and the shadow of uncertainty hung over the hilltop, as commanders on either side realized that the coming hours would not merely test the strength of arms, but the endurance, cunning, and unyielding will of men determined to define the fate of Gaul. The question lingered in the misted air. Could the coordinated ingenuity of Caesar's legions finally crush the spirit of a united Gallic resistance? Or would the day's relentless assaults signal the beginning of a protracted struggle that even Rome might struggle to contain? As night approached over the hilltop of Alesia, an uneasy calm settled across the battlefield, the smoke of torched outposts curling skyward like spectral fingers, and the cries of the wounded fading into a tense silence that seemed almost unnatural after a day of relentless combat. Roman soldiers patrolled the outer circumvallation with vigilant eyes, aware that the GIC forces had not yet exhausted their capacity for surprise, while engineers inspected fortifications for damage, repairing walls and repositioning artillery in preparation for renewed assaults at first light. Vercingetorix, his presence barely visible atop the ramparts, surveyed the Roman encirclement, understanding that the failure to coordinate the relief army with the garrison's ongoing skirmishes had cost them crucial momentum. Yet his mind churned with plans for the next phase of resistance, for he knew that Gaul itself was at stake and that, Desperation could inspire feats of valor and cunning beyond what might seem possible. Scouts and messengers moved under the cover of darkness, navigating treacherous terrain to relay intelligence between factions, while Roman cavalry silently intercepted and monitored these movements, each encounter reinforcing the psychological grip Rome had begun to exert over the fragmented but determined Gallic contingents. Within the Roman camp, the atmosphere was a careful balance between exhaustion and discipline. Officers communicated via hand signals and whispered orders, while soldiers maintained watch over sleeping comrades, their armor glinting dimly in the lantern light, the rhythmic tapping of sentries' spears on the ground punctuating the night like a metronome of vigilance. Observers centuries later speculate on the tension that gripped both sides, the weight of uncertainty pressing on commanders who knew that a single misstep or misjudgment could reverse fortunes overnight, turning carefully laid plans into ruin. Meanwhile, the outer fortifications, stretching for miles into the surrounding countryside, cast imposing shadows across forests and fields, concealing the immense labor and meticulous engineering that had gone into their construction. A testament to Roman ingenuity and the extraordinary logistical effort required to maintain a siege on such a scale. Small fires flickered among the Git camps, signaling assembly points or warning of imminent attacks, while the Roman forces interpreted these signs with practiced precision, preparing countermeasures that would allow them to respond quickly to any threat before it could gain momentum. Even in darkness, the interplay of strategy, deception, and raw human determination created a palpable energy across the landscape, an invisible tension vibrating through the air, as if the land itself awaited the outcome. As silence settled over Alesia, one could almost hear the heartbeat of the coming storm, the unrelenting anticipation of dawn when the clash of civilizations would resume, and the ultimate question lingered in the shadows. Would Caesar's meticulous siege finally force surrender, or could the indomitable spirit of the Gauls summon one last, decisive strike that might rewrite history in a single day? At the first light of dawn, the mist clung to the slopes of Montexuis like a fragile veil, blurring the lines between earth and sky and hiding the full scale of the Roman circumvallation from view, while the garrison within Alesia stirred, sharpening weapons and reinforcing barricades as though instinctively aware that the day would determine the fate of Gaul. Caesar, mounted upon his horse with a calm that belied the enormity of the operation, surveyed the encirclement, noting the precise alignment of towers, trenches, and concealed pits, each feature a deliberate measure to contain the enemy while protecting his own forces from the chaos of open battle. From the outer ramparts, scouts reported movement within the forests, small clusters of Gaulish warriors attempting to approach unseen, their steps muffled by damp earth, yet every approach was anticipated by Roman forces, archers ready to release a volley of arrows, engineers prepared to collapse temporary bridges, and cavalry poised to intercept with deadly precision. The GIC leadership convened in whispered councils within the walls, aware that coordinated action would be necessary to break the suffocating grip of Roman siege lines. Yet disagreements and the sheer stress of the prior days weighed heavily on their planning. Some suggested a direct assault on weakened sectors, others advocated sabotage of siege works, while a few dared to consider the impossible simultaneous sortie to link with approaching relief forces across the countryside. A maneuver fraught with risk but potentially decisive. Within the Roman camps, the disciplined rhythm of military life continued unbroken. Soldiers marched along parapets, Engineers inspected earthworks for erosion or breaches, and officers mapped the positions of every Gallic contingent, all under the calm but penetrating gaze of Caesar, who understood that leadership was as much psychological as tactical, that the morale of men often tipped the scales between victory and disaster as the sun rose higher, revealing the true expanse of Alesia's fortifications and the scale of the Roman investment in the siege. The psychological weight of containment pressed on the garrison, their food stores dwindling and water supplies closely guarded, while the knowledge that outside reinforcements were still days, perhaps weeks away, gnawed at the resolve of even the most steadfast warriors. The clash of civilizations hung suspended in the cool morning air, every arrow loosed, every wall inspected, every whispered plan carrying the potential to alter the trajectory of history. Observers centuries later suggest that the tension, the uncertainty, and the silent anticipation were nearly tangible, as if the earth itself held its breath. And so, as Alesia's defenders prepared for the inevitable confrontation and Roman forces readied to respond to whatever daring strike the Gauls might attempt, the stage was set for a sequence of maneuvers, feints, and assaults that would test the limits of human endurance. Tactical brilliance and the fragile line between survival and annihilation, the question lingered over the misty heights. Could the indomitable courage of the Gauls overcome Roman discipline? Or would Alesia's hilltop finally fall, sealing the fate of an entire people under the weight of history? As the day progressed, the rhythm of siege and resistance became a complex dance of anticipation and reaction, with every movement observed, calculated, and countered. Within Alesia, the GIC defenders exploited every ridge, every forested hollow, and every narrow path to create ambushes and sudden sallies, their intimate knowledge of the terrain allowing them to strike swiftly before melting back into the shadows, while Roman engineers adapted continuously, reinforcing walls, redirecting patrols, and constructing secondary fortifications to anticipate these unpredictable attacks. Each innovation a silent testament to the ingenuity born of prolonged conflict. The cacophony of war, from distant horns signaling coordinated sorties to the sharp crack of bows and the muffled roar of catapults, filled the air, creating a layered soundscape where strategy and chance collided. And yet beneath it all, a subtle tension prevailed, the kind that presses upon soldiers and civilians alike, shaping their thoughts and decisions in ways unseen by history. Caesar moved among his men, riding along the extensive circumvallation, his presence both symbolic and practical, inspiring loyalty while allowing him to witness firsthand the small details that could determine success or failure. The angle of a rampart, the alignment of a ballista, the morale etched on the faces of weary legionaries who had endured weeks of relentless labor under constant threat. Reports arrived of isolated clashes outside the outer wall, skirmishes where Gaulish scouts tested Roman patrols, probing for weaknesses and gathering intelligence, each encounter brief but telling, and each informing the next adjustment in the sprawling network of siege works that stretched over 20 miles in total, a scale that left few in history able to fully grasp the logistical mastery involved. Inside Alesia, rationing grew more stringent, and the strain of confinement began to weigh heavily on the defenders, yet they pressed on, motivated by a mix of desperation, honor, and a deep-seated desire to preserve the autonomy of their people. Some historians suggest that the psychological dimensions of siege warfare, the slow erosion of hope and the constant awareness of encirclement, were as lethal as any weapon employed on the battlefield. Meanwhile, news of the approaching relief forces reached both sides. heightening tension and forcing rapid recalculations. Roman commanders adjusted patrols, reinforced weak points, and prepared contingencies for a massive, coordinated assault that might arrive at any moment, while GIC leaders debated whether to attempt a risky breakout or to conserve strength for the hoped-for link-up with reinforcements. Every choice weighted by the knowledge that miscalculation could mean the annihilation of entire contingents. By late afternoon, the interplay of strategy, engineering, and sheer human will had created a delicate equilibrium, a suspended moment in which history itself seemed to pause, watching the outcome of a struggle that would determine the fate not just of Alesia, but of Gaul as a whole. And as the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows over the hilltop and the encircling fortifications, the question remained, who would seize the advantage when darkness fell? And could any force truly hold the upper hand against such relentless determination? Nightfall brought a different kind of warfare to Alesia, one where shadows became allies and the cool, mist-laden air carried whispers of movement that might be mistaken for wind. Yet every rustle of leaves or crack of twigs could signal the approach of scouts, raiders, or Roman sentries on patrol. Within the hilltop stronghold, the GIC defenders huddled close to smoldering fires, their faces illuminated by flickering flames, eyes scanning the darkness for signs of infiltration, while the rhythmic sounds of the outer circumvallation echoed faintly against the hills, reminding them that they remained encircled. Every path to freedom sealed by miles of meticulously constructed fortifications. For the Romans, night did not mean rest, but a calculated extension of the siege, with watch rotations ensuring that no corner of the perimeter remained unobserved, patrols moving silently yet deliberately, their footsteps muffled by the carefully laid earthworks and soft grasses, while engineers inspected and reinforced temporary barriers erected during the day. The sound of hammers and the creak of timber carrying unnervingly in the still night. The psychological tension was immense on both sides. Inside Alesia, hunger gnawed at the garrison, the scarcity of food rationed meticulously to stretch supplies, while morale wavered under the relentless pressure of encirclement and the looming threat of the massive relief army rumored to be converging from distant tribal territories. Outside, Roman soldiers felt the weight of responsibility, knowing that a single lapse could allow GIC forces to break through, or that surprise attacks could unravel weeks of painstaking fortification work. Some researchers suggest that the interplay between fear and discipline during these nocturnal hours was as decisive as any battlefield maneuver, with small actions and alerts sentry-spotting movement, a silent signal between commanders, a nighttime sortie to sabotage equipment tripling outward to influence the larger campaign. The darkness also provided opportunities for covert operations, messengers slipping between fortifications, reconnaissance parties navigating unseen paths, and desperate defenders attempting daring escapes or sabotage missions, each action carrying enormous risk, and each failure or success feeding into the growing narrative of the siege. Meanwhile, Caesar and his senior officers used the cover of night to review intelligence, adjust tactical plans, and anticipate the myriad ways in which both the GIC defenders and the approaching relief army might act. Their discussions informed by weeks of observation, reconnaissance reports, and intimate knowledge of both the terrain and enemy psychology, creating a dynamic where foresight became a weapon almost as important as swords or catapults. As the hours crawled forward and the first glimmers of dawn threatened the protective shroud of night, An uneasy calm settled over both camps, each side aware that the coming day would test their endurance, resolve, and ingenuity like never before. And in that fragile, tension-filled pause, one question lingered above all others. When the sun rose over Alesia, which force would truly control its fate? And who would be forced to reckon with the consequences of defeat? Dawn broke over Alesia with a muted light that cast long, jagged shadows across the Roman fortifications and the hilltop settlement alike, revealing the scars of the previous day's skirmishes while illuminating the meticulous precision of Caesar's circumvallation works. Roman soldiers stirred with a disciplined rhythm, armor clinking softly, banners fluttering in the morning breeze, their commanders moving along the lines with a calm authority that masked the underlying tension, while inside the GIC stronghold, defenders emerged from the relative safety of their shelters, gaunt faces etched with exhaustion, eyes scanning the encircling walls that had grown more formidable by the hour, realizing that every path to escape was blocked and that their survival depended on coordination, cunning, and the fragile hope that reinforcements might arrive in time. The morning was punctuated by the distant sounds of war horns and the rhythmic marching of the relief army, a reminder of the immense force slowly converging from multiple tribal territories, reportedly numbering hundreds of thousands, each contingent bringing its own weapons, tactics, and local knowledge, yet requiring delicate coordination to operate as a unified whole, a logistical challenge that tested the very limits of GIC organizational capacity. As the first volleys of Roman artillery erupted along the outer circumvallation, carefully aimed to disrupt assembling enemy formations without endangering their own troops, the GIC defenders responded with counter-barrages, arrows and sling stones raining down upon exposed Roman engineers, creating a cacophony of sound that mingled with the cries of soldiers, the splintering of wood, and the distant roar of horns, forming an almost tangible aura of tension that seemed to pulse across the battlefield. Caesar himself was visible atop a command platform, binoculars sweeping the horizon, observing not just the enemy positions, but the subtle movements within his own lines, issuing orders with deliberate precision, a blend of calculation and intuition that would determine the survival of his forces and the ultimate success of the siege. Researchers suggest that these early hours were critical in setting the psychological tone for the entire engagement, with morale, anticipation, and fear intertwining to influence both rational strategy and instinctive reaction. Every decision carried weight: which sectors to reinforce, which enemy approaches to anticipate, how to allocate scarce resources while keeping the troops motivated and alert. By mid-morning, the siege had transitioned from passive containment to active engagement, Roman forces probing for weaknesses, GIC forces attempting coordinated sorties, each movement observed, recorded, and countered in a tense dance of strategy and improvisation. And as the sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the battered landscape, a question lingered over Alesia. Could the defenders break the iron grip encircling them? Or would the combined weight of Roman engineering, discipline, and Caesar's leadership crush the last hopes of the GIC resistance before the relief army could turn the tide? By midday, the battle around Alesia had evolved into a complex tableau of anticipation, calculation, and sudden bursts of violence, where every movement carried both immediate tactical significance and long-term strategic consequence. Roman forces, organized into disciplined cohorts, adjusted continuously to threats both within and beyond the circumvallation, their engineers repairing breaches, repositioning artillery, and reinforcing fortifications while scouts darted along the outer edges to monitor the approaching Gic relief army, sending back crucial intelligence that would dictate the next series of maneuvers. Inside the hilltop stronghold, the GIC defenders faced the crushing reality of attrition, their numbers gradually thinning under constant bombardment, disease, and the stress of confined living, yet still coordinating daring sorties in an attempt to disrupt Roman works, exploiting every terrain feature, every weakness in the lines, yet constantly aware that failure could mean annihilation. The relief army, a massive and disparate assembly of tribal contingents, began arriving in staggered columns across the surrounding plains, their approach like a slowly darkening tide, banners and standards fluttering in the wind, war cries echoing faintly over the distance, each contingent bringing unique tactics, unfamiliar languages, and unpredictable behavior, challenging both their own unity and the Roman commander's ability to respond effectively to multiple, simultaneous threats. Scholars suggest that the coordination or lack thereof among these tribal forces was as critical to the outcome as the direct clashes with Roman troops, highlighting how leadership, communication, and logistical planning could determine victory or catastrophic defeat in engagements of such scale. Within the Roman camp, Caesar's presence remained the linchpin of morale, his calm authority a stabilizing force amidst the chaos as he moved from one sector to another, personally inspecting weak points, directing counterattacks, and inspiring soldiers to maintain discipline under pressure that would have shattered lesser forces. His strategic flexibility allowed for dynamic responses to GIC maneuvers, reinforcing sectors where the pressure was greatest, while preparing reserves to exploit emerging opportunities. Every arrow loosed, every artillery shot fired, every sortie launched from Alesia was part of a layered chessboard of combat, with stakes that extended beyond immediate survival, touching on the broader question of whether Roman authority could be firmly imposed across the entire region of Gaul. By the late afternoon, skirmishes intensified, relief columns edging closer, and the defenders inside Alesia began to coordinate a synchronized push against the Roman lines, an attempt to fracture the encirclement at a critical point, testing not just physical endurance but psychological resolve. Yet with every advance they faced pre-prepared killing zones, concealed pits, and artillery precisely calculated to disrupt formations. The day ended without a decisive breakthrough, but with both sides acutely aware that the coming hours could determine the fate of Gaul itself, leaving a lingering tension in the air, the distant rumble of approaching forces, and the haunting question, would the siege hold? Or would the combined might of the GIC relief army finally shatter Roman dominance? As night fell over the plains surrounding Alesia, an eerie stillness descended upon both Roman and GIC forces, a deceptive calm that belied the storm of conflict poised to erupt with the dawn. The flickering torchlight along the Roman circumvallation casting long, trembling shadows that danced across earthworks and sharpened stakes, creating the illusion of movement even in the absence of activity. While inside the hilltop fortress, the defenders huddled in darkened corridors and cramped quarters, the sounds of distant clashing, steel and shouted commands replaced by the low murmurs of exhaustion, fear, and grim determination. Historians suggest that these nocturnal pauses were as psychologically significant as the battles themselves, allowing commanders to assess, plan, and manipulate morale. In the Roman camp, Caesar convened his lieutenants, tracing the positions of approaching relief columns on crude maps, weighing options that ranged from aggressive preemptive strikes to patient containment, fully aware that the arrival of the GIC army would introduce variables that could overwhelm even his meticulously prepared fortifications. His decisions balanced tactical prudence with the necessity of maintaining initiative, for even a temporary perception of weakness could embolden the disparate tribal forces to exploit gaps or disjointed coordination. The JIC relief contingents, spread across miles of countryside, faced their own challenges, their movements slowed by terrain, the need to maintain cohesion among independent tribes, and the constant threat of Roman reconnaissance disrupting their advance. Some leaders advocated for immediate assault, others for encircling maneuvers, illustrating the fragile unity that had allowed them to amass such a formidable force, but also revealing the vulnerabilities inherent in a coalition drawn from diverse cultures and military traditions. Scouts reported glimmers of Roman activity along the raiding parties, probing defenses, signaling a level of preparation and intelligence gathering that many of the GIC leaders had underestimated, and forcing them to reconsider timing and formation. While inside Alesia, commanders debated whether to launch nocturnal sorties that might damage siege works or conserve strength for a coordinated daylight offensive. Sleep came fitfully to soldiers on both sides, punctuated by distant sounds of animals startled by movement, occasional skirmishes along the perimeter, and the ever-present tension of anticipation. Some researchers believe that the psychological toll of this suspended night, the feeling of being watched and contained, contributed to the eventual breakdown of GIC coordination, eroding confidence before combat even resumed. As the first pale light of morning crept across Montexuis and the plains below, the siege lines glistened with dew, stakes and earthworks outlined in sharp relief. Roman artillery positioned with lethal precision, and Alesia's defenders braced themselves for the inevitable clash, a collision of disciplined strategy and desperate resolve, leaving the question hanging in the cold morning air, which force would seize control when the silence finally shattered. At first light, the quiet over Alesia shattered as Roman siege engines began their relentless mechanical rhythm. The pounding of hammers, the screech of wheeled artillery, and the low, metallic groan of tensioned torsion springs echoing across the hillside. A terrifying symphony of preparation that signaled both the inevitability of confrontation and the precision of Roman engineering. While within the fortress, garrison soldiers strained to listen, counting each sound and interpreting it as a harbinger of the coming assault, or an opportunity to exploit a perceived weakness. Historians note that such auditory cues played a surprisingly critical role in ancient warfare, influencing morale and decision-making before a single arrow was loosed. Caesar's legions moved with deliberate coordination along the inner circumvallation, engineers overseeing repairs and reinforcements, centurions shouting commands that cut through the morning mist, their voices carrying across the hills as if to remind both allies and enemies of the order and discipline that defined Roman military culture. And yet, even amidst this calculated preparation, the unpredictability of human resolve remained an ever-present factor, a variable that no amount of planning could entirely control. Beyond the outer fortifications, the massive JIC relief army began to emerge from the forests and rolling plains, a seemingly endless tide of warriors brandishing weapons of varied design, banners snapping in the wind, and horns echoing tribal calls that reverberated like a drumbeat across the valley. The scale alone inspired awe and dread, a living testament to the organizational ability and fervor of the Celtic Confederation. And yet their coordination, though impressive, was vulnerable to disruption by the structured discipline and engineering advantages that Caesar had painstakingly implemented. Scouts on both sides reported skirmishes breaking out along forward positions, probing attacks that tested strength and response time, small units clashing briefly before melting back into the shadows, creating a sense of continuous pressure without committing to full engagement. A psychological war that mirrored the physical one, wearing down nerves, exhausting the body, and forcing split-second decisions that could determine life or death. Within Alesia, leaders debated the timing of sorties and signal communications, aware that a single misstep could collapse their carefully maintained defensive perimeter. While on the plains, tribal commanders struggled to maintain cohesion among thousands of warriors from diverse backgrounds, each motivated by honor, vengeance, or survival, a complex network of loyalties that could fracture under the intensity of sustained confrontation. As midday approached, the tension became almost tangible, a heavy atmosphere that clung to armor, weapons, and earthworks alike, sunlight glinting off polished shields and casting long, shifting shadows across trenches and ditches, while the distant rumble of assembled forces hinted at the catastrophic collisions yet to come, leaving a lingering, almost hypnotic question hanging in the air. When the full might of these two worlds finally collided, could either truly emerge unscathed? As the sun climbed higher over the Gallic plains, the battle around Alesia entered a precarious rhythm, each moment pregnant with possibility, the clash of steel and the cries of men echoing across the fortified hills as if the landscape itself had become a witness to the unfolding drama. Roman engineers continued their work with meticulous care, reinforcing walls, repairing breaches, and supervising the placement of concealed traps, while the legions drilled continuously, practicing rapid redeployments and forming defensive formations that could respond to the unpredictable tactics of the GIC forces. Some historians suggest that this combination of preparation, discipline, and anticipation gave the Romans a psychological edge, turning the very terrain into an extension of their military will. While the GIC relief army pressed forward in waves, each contingent attempting to exploit perceived weaknesses, to find a seam in the meticulously woven Roman defenses, their numbers vast, their ferocity unmatched, yet hampered by a lack of centralized coordination beyond the signals relayed from their commanders, whose eyes strained to see patterns emerging amidst the chaos, to anticipate Roman responses to each maneuver. On the inner hilltop, garrison forces conducted daring sorties, small groups slipping through hidden gaps in the circumvallation to strike at Roman engineers and supply lines, setting fires, dismantling fortifications, or attempting to lure legions into ambushes, while Caesar's cavalry units moved like shadows along the periphery, intercepting raiding parties, cutting off retreat paths, and maintaining pressure on the enemy, demonstrating an intimate understanding of both terrain and psychology, as if the Romans were playing a long, deadly game of chess across fields, forests, and fortified walls, and each piece carried the weight of life or death. Beyond the immediate fighting, scouts and messengers crisscrossed the battlefield, relaying information, confirming the positions of enemy contingents, reporting on reinforcements, and adjusting strategies in real time, a dizzying network of communication that required both trust and discipline to function under the duress of constant attack. While the GIC commanders struggled to maintain cohesion among hundreds of thousands of warriors, their morale fluctuating with every clash, every failed assault, and every demonstration of Roman endurance and engineering prowess. By late afternoon, the battlefield had become a living entity, breathing with the movements of tens of thousands, echoing with the sounds of hammers, metal, and war cries. the dust rising in hazy clouds that blurred the distinction between friend and foe, observer and participant, creating an almost dreamlike panorama of chaos and precision intertwined, leaving both sides teetering on the edge of exhaustion and opportunity. And, as shadows lengthened across the plains, the lingering question remained, haunting and palpable. Which side would seize the decisive moment before nightfall enveloped the land in uncertainty? As twilight descended over Alesia, the battlefield transformed into a theater of shifting shadows and uneasy stillness, the cries of combat fading into intermittent clashes as both sides paused to regroup, Roman soldiers tending to the wounded, reinforcing weakened sections of the circumvallation, while GIC leaders reorganized scattered contingents, their massive army beginning to show signs of fatigue and disarray despite its size and ferocity. Some scholars suggest that it was in this liminal space between day and night that Caesar's genius truly manifested, exploiting the psychological fragility of exhausted enemies while maintaining the discipline of his legions, ensuring that no position became vulnerable, no flank left exposed, and no opportunity wasted. The Romans moving with a quiet precision that contrasted sharply with the chaotic energy of the Gallic forces, whose morale began to waver as the realization set in that the walls, pits, and fortifications they had so relentlessly tried to breach seemed almost impervious, absorbing their assaults and sapping their strength. Meanwhile, the inner stronghold of Alesia remained tense. Garrison forces peering from parapets, eyes scanning the horizon for signs of relief or renewed attack. The faint glimmer of torches reflecting off sharpened stakes and walls that had been carefully engineered to create the illusion of depth and complexity, forcing attackers into predetermined zones of vulnerability. Historians note that this layered defensive strategy, combining psychological intimidation with tangible obstacles, magnified the Romans' advantage, creating a battlefield where perception often mattered as much as physical force. And the Celts, despite their numbers and bravery, found themselves navigating an invisible maze that drained both energy and confidence. As night fell fully, fires from both sides illuminated the battlefield in flickering bursts, smoke curling into the cold evening air, mingling with the sounds of distant horns, the clash of small skirmishes, and the ever-present hum of anticipation, a reminder that the true contest was far from over, and that survival, strategy, and timing would define the outcome as much as sheer force. Caesar, observing from elevated positions, adjusted his formations, repositioned artillery, and issued quiet, deliberate commands to ensure readiness for any dawn offensive, while the GIC commanders faced the mounting anxiety of coordinating a massive, fatigued army under conditions of confusion and darkness, aware that one misstep could unravel their entire operation. In this tension-filled pause, where the battlefield seemed suspended between two worlds, the stakes of Alesia crystallized, not merely the survival of soldiers, but the future of Gallic resistance itself, the outcome hanging in delicate balance. A question that would be answered only with the first light of a new day. And as the cold night deepened, a pervasive, almost tangible suspense settled over the hills, leaving both sides haunted by uncertainty and anticipation of the horrors yet to come. With the first pale light of dawn stretching across the hills of Alesia, Roman forces emerged from their fortified encampments with meticulous precision. The disciplined clatter of armor and the rhythmic stamping of legionaries' feet forming a steady, intimidating cadence that contrasted sharply with the weary and disorganized jick formations, attempting to regroup after a night of uneasy tension. Some historians suggest that Caesar's decision to advance at this precise hour was a deliberate psychological tactic, exploiting the vulnerability of an enemy caught between fatigue and uncertainty, maximizing the effect of both surprise and discipline while maintaining complete control over his own forces. The Gallic leaders, aware that their relief contingents were delayed or scattered, struggled to coordinate attacks, sending messengers through dense smoke and fog, only to encounter miscommunication and hesitation. The massive scale of their army now more a liability than an asset, as thousands of warriors moved into zones deliberately structured by Roman engineers to funnel and trap them. The sharpened stakes, concealed pits, and overlapping fields of fire transforming the landscape into a deadly maze that punished even the most skilled combatants. As Caesar observed the initial engagement, small cavalry units were dispatched to probe weak points, testing Gallic cohesion while simultaneously drawing attention away from the main Roman assault lines. The psychological effect of these maneuvers, amplifying the perception of omnipresent Roman control and creating uncertainty that would ripple through the GIC ranks, eroding morale even as they attempted to mount coordinated resistance. Artillery placements unleashed precise volleys, sending projectiles over walls and into gathering points, each strike calculated not merely for physical damage, but to create confusion, fear, and hesitation, turning what might have been a straightforward clash of numbers into a battle where strategy and foresight determined survival. Meanwhile, the hilltop garrison of Alesia faced a critical choice: continue futile resistance against impregnable fortifications or attempt breakout maneuvers that risked annihilation in the exposed terrain below. And as morning progressed, skirmishes intensified along multiple fronts, Roman engineers and legionaries repairing breaches almost as quickly as they occurred, demonstrating an adaptability and logistical coordination that few ancient armies could rival. While GIC forces found themselves repeatedly funneled into killing zones, their momentum shattered, and their morale deteriorating further under the combined weight of discipline, psychological warfare, and physical barriers. The day would not end in a single decisive action, yet every maneuver, every clash, and every decision moved inexorably toward a conclusion that would define the fate of Gaul, leaving observers to wonder whether the brilliance of Roman strategy or the sheer berzel of the Gallic resistance would ultimately prevail. And as the sun rose higher, casting long shadows across the embattled plains, the intricate interplay of engineering, psychology, and battlefield command revealed itself in full, a harbinger of the monumental consequences that would follow this pivotal confrontation. As the battle for Alesia wore on, the sheer scale of Roman engineering and military discipline became increasingly apparent. The outer circumvallation and inner fortifications, functioning not merely as physical barriers but as instruments of psychological dominance, shaping the flow of combat in ways that few Gallic warriors could anticipate or counter. Some researchers believe that Caesar's meticulous planning here reflected a culmination of lessons drawn from earlier campaigns, where impulsive assaults or underestimation of enemy ingenuity had led to costly setbacks. And now every trench, palisade, and artillery emplacement was orchestrated to manipulate the battlefield itself, channeling enemy movements into pre-designated zones where Roman forces could exploit both terrain and technology. From one flank to another, skirmishes erupted as smaller GIC contingents attempted infiltration and sabotage, only to encounter concealed pitfalls, camouflaged stakes, and rapid Roman counterattacks that underscored the seamless coordination between legionaries and engineers. And in the midst of this chaos, the hilltop garrison faced relentless pressure from both inside and outside. Their attempts to breach the walls thwarted by overlapping fields of fire, precision volleys, and the constant threat of encirclement. Each failed maneuver compounding disarray and uncertainty among their ranks. Meanwhile, Caesar personally oversaw cavalry deployments, issuing orders with a clarity that instilled confidence and purpose among his officers, while projecting an aura of omnipresence to the enemy, a combination of charisma and tactical acumen that many historians argue was as decisive as any fortification or weapon. And as day progressed, the GIC relief army, still attempting to converge on the embattled stronghold, found itself constrained by Roman strategic foresight, forced into predictable paths of advance where terrain and fortifications amplified Roman defensive advantages, their numerical superiority blunted by careful positioning and anticipation, demonstrating that the outcome of battles in this era depended as much on planning and adaptability as on raw strength. The psychological toll of these conditions manifested in visible hesitation and fragmented attacks, as commanders struggled to maintain cohesion, sending messengers who were intercepted or delayed, leaving units acting independently and often disastrously, while Roman signals and coordinated volleys exploited every gap, every moment of indecision, and every overextension, slowly eroding the ability of the Gallic forces to respond effectively. And yet, despite these overwhelming challenges, pockets of fierce resistance emerged, warriors displaying remarkable courage and resilience, reminding observers that history is rarely determined by numbers alone, but by the interplay of strategy, environment, and the human spirit, leaving a lingering question that would haunt both armies in a conflict defined by ingenuity, discipline, and sheer determination. Could the Gallic will endure? Or was Alesia destined to become the fulcrum upon which the fate of an entire people would pivot? The aftermath of Alesia was not merely a matter of battlefield victory. It unfolded as a calculated exercise in the consolidation of power, a sweeping reorganization of territory, loyalty, and resources that would define the trajectory of Roman influence across Gaul for decades. As Caesar's legions moved methodically through the conquered regions, implementing fortifications, administrative centers, and roads, every act designed to transform a landscape of fractious tribes into a controlled and integrated provincial system. Some scholars suggest that this systematic approach to conquest reflected not only a desire for immediate security, but also a long-term vision of governance, where military prowess and bureaucratic efficiency reinforced one another. And as settlements were reconstructed or newly established, the Romans imposed a structured urban plan, introducing forums, and temples that served both practical administrative functions and symbolic assertions of dominance, demonstrating to local populations that Roman authority was tangible, omnipresent, and enduring. The sensory impact of these constructions cannot be overstated. Massive stone walls, the rhythmic clatter of construction, and the smell of freshly cut timber combining to create a permanent imprint of Roman order on the land. While rural territories were reorganized to maximize agricultural output, ensuring that tribute could be collected efficiently, and that supply lines for the military and administration remained secure. The road networks, stretching for hundreds of miles, connected formerly isolated communities, enabling rapid troop movements, consistent communication, and trade integration. Some researchers argue that these roads themselves became instruments of control, transforming the mobility of conquered peoples into a mechanism of Roman oversight. And while the military and administrative measures imposed order, the cultural integration was subtler yet equally pervasive, as Celtic elites were co-opted into Roman educational and political systems, learning Latin, Roman law, and military techniques, creating a bilingual and bicultural intermediary class that facilitated governance while preserving selected elements of traditional identity. At the same time, religious practices were adapted, Druidic sanctuaries suppressed or repurposed, with rituals and symbols gradually incorporated into Roman frameworks, demonstrating that control extended beyond the physical and into the spiritual. The very psyche of conquered peoples, the extraction of wealth through tribute, mining, and the slave trade, further reinforced the consequences of resistance, ensuring both economic gain and the psychological imprint of Roman dominance. Yet, despite the systematic efficiency, isolated pockets of defiance persisted. In forests, hills, and remote regions, where the resilience of the Celtic spirit found expression in guerrilla tactics, raids, and cultural preservation, forcing the Romans to remain vigilant. A reminder that conquest is never absolute, and that the tensions between control and resistance would shape Gaul's landscape for generations. And as one reflects on this phase of the Gallic Wars, one must consider the paradox of Caesar's campaign, that through destruction, assimilation, and meticulous order, an enduring cultural synthesis emerged, creating a legacy that would resonate across Europe for centuries, leaving a haunting question for historians and dreamers alike. When an empire imposes itself with such precision and foresight, can the spirit of a people truly be erased? Or does it survive, quietly, in the margins, waiting for the next chapter of history to awaken it? As the dust of conquest settled across Gaul, the transformation of the land and its people became increasingly evident, a process that was as much psychological as it was physical. The remnants of Celtic autonomy lingered in subtle ways, in language, art, and oral traditions, even as the roads, forts, and administrative centers imposed the unmistakable imprint of Roman order. Some historians suggest that this hybridization of culture was an unintended consequence of conquest, a blending where Roman efficiency met Celtic resilience, creating a complex social landscape that neither fully conformed to Rome nor remained entirely independent. In towns and newly established settlements, Roman architectural styles dominated, with stone buildings, forums, and temples replacing the wooden structures of the past. The smell of lime and mortar, the echoing footsteps on cobbled streets, and the distant clang of workshops producing tools and goods for trade all contributed to a sensory environment that reinforced Roman authority. Yet in villages and rural territories, traditional practices persisted. Agricultural techniques adapted to Roman methods while retaining elements of Celtic knowledge. Seasonal festivals continued, sometimes subtly modified to fit within the Roman calendar, and local crafts remained highly valued. The roads connecting these regions facilitated not only the movement of armies, but also the circulation of ideas, goods, and people, allowing Roman merchants to establish permanent trade posts, where luxury items from the Mediterranean met local products, creating economic interdependence that further tied Gaul to the wider empire. Military integration played a key role in this transformation. Former Celtic warriors joined auxiliary units, their combat skills and knowledge of terrain harnessed to serve Roman objectives, while service offered social mobility, citizenship, and a stake in the stability of the new order. Caesar's strategic vision extended beyond immediate control, emphasizing the creation of loyalty through incentives as well as deterrence. Yet the shadow of rebellion never fully disappeared. Forested regions and remote settlements harbored insurgents, who struck at supply lines, garrisons, and collaborators, reminding both Romans and locals that the conquest was not merely territorial but ongoing. Politically, economically, and culturally, the assimilation of Gaul reshaped traditional hierarchies, with Roman-trained elites mediating between imperial authority and local populations, education in Latin, law, and governance producing intermediaries capable of administering while respecting select aspects of indigenous customs. Religious adaptation reinforced this structure. Druidic practices suppressed or repurposed. Sacred sites altered to align with Roman interpretations, reflecting a calculated approach to psychological as well as structural control. The extraction of wealth through tribute, mining, and slavery continued, cementing both Roman prosperity and the consequences of resistance. Yet, amid the apparent stability, the interplay of Roman order and Celtic persistence created a tension that would echo through generations. A reminder that cultural conquest is never absolute, that the spirit of a people can endure quietly beneath the surface, and that even the most meticulously planned empire must contend with the unpredictable pulse of human resilience, leaving us to wonder how much of Gaul's identity was lost, and how much survived, hidden within the roads, the walls, and the hearts of those who endured. With the military campaigns concluded and the physical structures of Roman control firmly in place, attention turned to the long-term implications of Caesar's conquest, not merely in terms of territory but in shaping the very framework of Western European society. The integration of Gaul into the Roman world represented a profound experiment in governance, economy, and culture, one that would ripple outward for centuries. Some scholars argue that the lessons learned in Gaul influenced Roman strategy in other frontier regions, where a combination of military presence, economic incentives, and cultural assimilation became the preferred tools of expansion. The legacies of roads, garrisons, and administrative centers were more than functional. They were symbols of power, channels of influence, and instruments for reshaping society according to Roman ideals in Gaul. The interplay between compliance and resistance created a dynamic tension that would shape the region's evolution. While many communities adapted and benefited from Roman systems, others chafed under the weight of taxation, conscription, and cultural imposition. The former Celtic aristocracy was either embracing Roman administrative roles or fading into obscurity, their influence redirected into managing local affairs under imperial oversight. The military integration of former warriors ensured loyalty while simultaneously reshaping the art of war in the region. Hybrid units combined Roman tactical precision with Celtic adaptability and knowledge of the terrain, creating a precedent for European military traditions that would survive the fall of Rome. The economic transformation was equally striking. Agriculture, mining, and trade was systematically organized to serve imperial priorities. Roads enabled commerce and communication. Markets flourished with a mixture of local and imported goods. Yet every transaction reinforced Rome's dominance culturally. The synthesis of Roman and Celtic traditions created a layered society. Latin and Celtic languages coexisted. Roman legal and educational systems intersected with local customs, and religious practices evolved through both suppression and adaptation. The surviving Celtic elements infused Roman frameworks with distinct regional character, producing communities that were neither fully Roman nor entirely Celtic. This duality persisted across centuries, influencing medieval European identity, governance, and culture, even as new powers rose and fell. The memory of Gaul's conquest informed political calculations, the use of force tempered by integration strategies. The balance between coercion and assimilation became a model for future imperial projects. In reflecting on this period, one can sense the extraordinary scale of transformation, not only the physical rearrangement of landscapes, the imposition of roads, forts, and cities, but the subtle, enduring reshaping of social norms, cultural identities, and power structures. The echoes of Caesar's campaigns reverberated through generations, leaving us to ponder. In creating order and security, did Rome extinguish the spirit of Gaul? Or did it forge something new from the remnants of resistance? A civilization both conquered and enduring, ready to influence the centuries yet to come. The aftermath of the Gallic Wars extended far beyond the immediate military and political victories, weaving a complex tapestry of cultural, social, and economic transformations that would echo through the centuries. The lands of Gaul, once fractured into independent tribal territories, now operated under a unified framework where Roman law, administration, and infrastructure intersected with enduring Celtic traditions. Some researchers suggest that this fusion created a resilience in local populations, enabling them to retain elements of their identity even while participating in the Roman system. The urban landscapes that emerged bore the marks of both conquest and adaptation. Forums and basilicas rose alongside older hilltop settlements. Temples reflected Roman religious practices, while subtly incorporating Celtic motifs, and road networks stitched together previously isolated communities into a vast, interconnected province economically. The exploitation of natural resources from mineral wealth to agricultural production was meticulously organized. Taxation systems and tribute obligations ensured a steady flow of goods and wealth toward Rome. Yet, within this structure, local elites found avenues for influence, trade, and personal advancement, creating a delicate balance between coercion and cooperation militarily. The integration of Celtic warriors into Roman auxiliary units preserved local martial knowledge while embedding Roman discipline and tactics. Hybrid forces became essential to maintaining control over remote regions, their dual identities reflecting both continuity and transformation. Socially, education and language served as instruments of Romanization. Young nobles and promising individuals received instruction in Latin. Roman political thought and administrative skills, positioning them as intermediaries between imperial authorities and their communities. This bilingual and bicultural elite would play a crucial role in sustaining regional stability even as central Roman authority fluctuated. The suppression of resistance, the destruction of rebellious strongholds, and the strategic placement of garrisons established patterns of dominance that served both practical and psychological purposes, demonstrating the consequences of defiance while embedding the infrastructure necessary for governance. Culturally, the process was subtle yet profound. Celtic artistic styles and religious practices persisted, often reinterpreted within Roman frameworks. Festivals and ceremonies adapted, languages intertwined, and oral traditions continued to transmit local knowledge and values. The enduring effect was the creation of a distinctive regional identity that neither entirely surrendered to Rome nor remained untouched by conquest. In the long term, the Gallic Wars set precedents for imperial expansion, integration, and control, offering lessons in administration, military strategy, and cultural negotiation that would inform Rome's approach across Europe and beyond. The convergence of conquest and assimilation produced a landscape where military, economic, and cultural elements were inseparable, shaping the trajectories of communities and influencing the political, social, and cultural evolution of Europe for centuries. The legacy of these wars is not simply measured in territory or wealth, but in the complex, layered societies that emerged, hybrid civilizations that carried traces of Celtic freedom, Roman order, and the enduring tension between the two, leaving historians and observers alike to consider the profound ways in which conflict, ambition, and strategy can permanently reshape the course of human history.